Hello, how's your week been? Anything exciting happened? Well, I need to tell you about my week. And to tell you about my week, I have a little picture. And this is something that wasn't there at the beginning of my week, but is certainly around in the world, new to the world now. This is my little grandson, and his name is Reuben. Now, Reuben was born out in Switzerland, so I don't know when I'll get to see him and cuddle him, but I have been able to see him on a Zoom meeting. He didn't say a lot. In fact, he was asleep through the whole thing, but he's very cute. Now, Reuben's mummy and daddy spent a long time thinking about Reuben's name, what name they wanted to choose. And they came up with Reuben, and his second name is Beau, which in French is beautiful. And that's a lovely thing because the part of Switzerland that they live in speaks French. But the reason they chose Beau is because when my daughter-in-law Andrea was a little girl, she used to call her daddy Bobo. And so it was sort of after her dad that she called Reuben Beau as a second name. But here's the strange thing. When my son Nicholas went to register Reuben as being born in Switzerland and having this name, the Swiss officials said, well, we'll have to check to see if you're allowed to call your baby Beau, because that's not in our normal list. Now, the Swiss are very, very careful about what people are allowed to call their children. In the end, it was all right, and he is called Reuben Beau. But imagine being told that you couldn't call your child something. Imagine you had picked your favourite name and somebody said, no, you can't call him that or her that. No, we're not letting you. How awful. Or even worse, imagine if Nicholas and Andrea had decided to call that baby Reuben and I said, no, you're not going to call it Reuben. We're going to call it Andrew. Wouldn't that be dreadful? Well, the Bible story today is actually about something exactly like that. It's about 4 young men who had perfectly good names, and their names meant something to them, and they were told that they couldn't use those names anymore. Now, in my Bible, you might be able to see there's a whole book named after a man called Daniel. Now, the name Daniel means God is my judge. So Daniel's name was very important to him. And he had 3 friends. And their names were very important to them too. But something happened that meant that they got their names changed. So I'm going to tell you the beginning of the story of Daniel.
So our story of Daniel begins, as you can see, with Daniel and his friends and some other people all being taken away by some soldiers. Now, why would that be? Well, Daniel and his 3 friends lived in Jerusalem, and the king of Babylon was having a war, and he came to Jerusalem and he won a battle in Jerusalem, and so he took some of the young men and some of the older men away from Jerusalem back to Babylon, trying to change them the way they thought, the way they worshipped. He thought if he could change them, then maybe he could wipe out a whole lot of other nations. So Daniel and his 3 friends were called Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and each one of them had had their names carefully chosen. But when they went back to Babylon, the king changed their names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. and Azariah he called Abednego. Now those names didn't mean anything to those 4 young men, and it was very strange to have their names changed, but that was all part of trying to make them forget about God and how they had lived, thinking and following God when they were in Jerusalem. Well, the other thing that the king wanted to do was to change the way the young men ate. The young men were taken in by a steward, someone who looked after a household, and the steward showed them the sort of food that they would be expected to eat. Now, some of this food may have been used in temples, and so Daniel and his friends knew that it wasn't right to eat that food. Not only that, but Daniel and his 3 friends had a special set of foods that they knew that God wanted them to eat. So Daniel went to the steward and said, "Please, we don't want to eat this food. Let us eat the food that our God allows us to." Well, the steward was really upset because he said, "If you don't eat the food that the king has suggested you eat, and then you get a bit sick or a bit weak, he's going to take it out on me. Oh, please eat the food that's been given to you." Daniel put his hand on the steward's shoulder. "Now, why don't you trust us for 10 days," he said, "just 10 days, and let us eat vegetables and the food that we are allowed to eat. And if at the end of 10 days we look poorly and we're not very healthy, then we'll see about eating the food that you suggested." So the steward was very brave and said, "I'll give you those 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends weren't just healthy, they were healthier than many of the other young men in the court of Babylon. In fact, they were so healthy and looked so well that the steward actually brought them to the king and said, "Look at these young men. They have a God that they follow, and they have a God that they worship, and they say that their God protects them, and they say that their God has given them special foods to keep them healthy and well, and look at them." Well, the king was amazed because they did. Each one of them looked very healthy. But more importantly than just looking healthy, Daniel and his 3 friends were very clever, very wise. And the king asked them lots of questions, and all their answers were at least as wise as some of the men in the court, and were much wiser than some of the other young men in the court. And the king thought for a while and said, "Do you know, I would like to use you as my advisors in different parts of my country. Would you do that?" And Daniel and his 3 friends said yes, but they said one important thing. They said to the king of Babylon, "We will serve you, but we want you to know that we have a greater king who is in charge of us, and we will always worship and follow him no matter what. We will always put our God, our king in heaven ahead of anyone else." And the king of Babylon said, "All right, sign here." And they all became special advisors in the court of the king of Babylon. And they stayed healthy, and they followed and worshipped their God. But that's just the beginning of the story of Daniel. Next week, we're going to hear a little bit about not so much Daniel, but his 3 brave friends. See you next week.